we're going to go into our final session, and this will ultimately conclude in a panel. We've got 3 speakers as part of this session. So the first speaker up will be Elan Sudberg, followed by Rend Al-Mondhiry, followed by Michael Barr, and each of them will give a short presentation covering different aspects and considerations of this concept, new paradigms in mental health, the time of psychedelics. And then we will go into a 10 or 15-minute Q&A/discussion. I know that these people are veterans of the industry, varied experience, some common threads of conversation, and then some specifics in their areas of expertise. Okay, but first up in this session is actually Elan. So Elan, if you want to pop on screen and pop on Prezi, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Len. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. Can you hear me okay, Len?
Yep, your volume is great.
Perfect. I'm going to share my screen. And it looks like that's working. Perfect.
Okay.
Everyone see the Prezi moving around? Okay. First, hello, everyone. My name is Elan Sudberg, CEO of Alchemist Labs. I'm very grateful for your attention today, and also for the event organizers, Natural Informed, Len, and Heather, and your amazing teams. You guys put on great content, and this is a really exciting feast of information for us all. I'm going to be speaking today on the topic of new paradigms in mental health. I love the fact that we call it the time of psychedelics, which is it's kind of always been. It's just back, and it's coming strong and hot. So real quick, background on Alchemist Labs. We were born in 1997, actually, to a tincture manufacturer named Elan Sudberg, who's my father, our CSO, and the founder of Alchemist Labs. He had a line of tinctures he gave to his patients when he was a chiropractor and acupuncturist. We made those not in a garage like some of these companies that are doing all right these days, who all started in garages. We made the tinctures actually in a garage, but then the lab was born as a result of testing the tincture quality, the ingredient quality. The lab was born in a colonic irrigation room. It had good plumbing, and that's my joke for the day. The person who was running that service in my father's facility was invited to leave, and we made a lab in that room, and the rest is history. Back then in 97, there were GMPs, but they were poorly enforced. The FDA did do some version of enforcement, but not a lot like you see these days. So it was unclear who to test for, why to test, what methods to use. But then something excited the FDA, which was consumer trust erosion, which is a function of an adulteration of Plantago lanceolata and Digitalis lanata. One plant worked really good for the gut, the other one worked really good for the heart, or bad for the heart, and they got mixed up, and you can imagine chaos ensued. People ended up in the hospital with heart attacks. Fortunately, the FDA responded by assembling a pharmacognosys dream team. That's a mouthful, that word. That team consisted of George Ziobro, Joe Betts, Bill Overmeyer, and Stan Chikowitz. The only one still active in the industry is obviously Joe Betts. We took those courses, learned a lot, brought it back to the lab, had lots and lots of time. You remember, this is 97-ish, so this is 10 years before the GMPs actually were republished. So plenty of time to work with APA and join every single committee that existed and get really active in the industry, as well as work with AHP and Roy Upton's group to help facilitate some of the early monographs for the microscopy section. We collected lots of botanicals that we keep in our herbarium on site, which houses over 2,000 species, almost 20,000 specimens on site to test your specimens. We make tiny little extracts from that, and we can provide very fast turnaround time for whatever you throw at us. We do this all in a beautiful facility, now going on 5 years. I almost said 3 the other day, so time is flying. That area where people are walking is now full of all sorts of new instrumentation. And we do this with a very happy team. In 2020, we won the Tiny Pole's Happiest Place to Work award. I'm very proud of that. A few more details, and we'll go into some more information on the panel, but some disclosures. You might know me from these things. Crushing the adulterated hoodia market with a single light microscope. No joke. We can talk about that later if you'd like. Starting the industry's first cannabis committee, which is pivotal to this topic. Hopefully it doesn't follow the same path that cannabis did. Arguing for fit purpose methods when the tricorders showed up. Whenever these new methods show up, these lab in a box things, I'm always first to fight against the invalid techniques that are supposed to save the day. Leading the efforts of consumer access to next generation transparency and lab testing. You do the testing, show the results. Let's improve the consumer confidence index. And then last but not least, and most important for today's discussion, is starting the industry's first psychedelic plant and fungi committee. We did that through APA. Fortunately, APA has the gumption to be first and started the cannabis committee first in the industry, and everything else happened after that. I'm not sure if I should say sorry or you're welcome. And then obviously we've now started the Psychedelic Plant and Fungus Committee. Into great details of that. So APA is really great for providing expertise, leadership of product quality, marketing, sustainability, and regulatory framework that these, our most strong herbs and fungi, with big pharma targets on their leaves, lianas, and basidiocarbs need right now more than ever as we get closer and closer to rescheduling with the DEA. I'll say it again, chamomile, St. John's wort, green tea, all great important herbs, but the ones that we're talking about now are the most powerful on the planet. The committee purpose, and this is something we just finalized, is to address the issues related to safe use and responsible commerce of naturally derived products from psychedelic plants and fungi. I'm not quite sure where toad venom fits in there, if it does at all, or ketamine, but we're not talking about plants and fungi with those two. So sticking just to plants and fungus. We actually had our second meeting just the other day, and I'm proud to say that we have 3 really great working groups. One has already been successful in writing and adopting a clear and concise committee charter. It's really important because, as we all know, committee charters start to creep and move around and we lose focus. We will not be doing that with this committee. Working group number 2 is social reciprocity, equity, benefit sharing with Indigenous knowledge keepers. As you can imagine, the time of psychedelics, as this title is, it's been that way for a long time. And the folks who use these medicines in their culture, so to speak, tribal knowledge, will be exploited if we don't do something about that. And the hunger for these materials, plants and fungus, is gaining probably quicker than the knowledge base can be shared. So we're interested in social reciprocity and equity and benefit sharing with the Indigenous knowledge keepers. And then the working group number 3 is preservation and sustainability. Similarly to the herbs that we love and pay our mortgages from, a lot of these herbs are going to be endangered if we're not careful, and sustainable harvesting and preservation of these materials are really critically important. And then the last working group, which is just proposed right now, it's not official, is something about quality and legal aspects. So from a lab perspective, which is where I sit, there is no regulatory framework allowing analytical labs to provide critically needed quality control services to the quickly growing industry. So here's how this works. We have a DEA registration for scheduled 1, 2, 3, and 4, which means I can't test for anyone else who doesn't have a DEA registration. So with the DEA registration, you are restricted to use other folks with DEA registrations, which is basically few and far between. We're talking big, medium, and small pharma, and those lucky enough to get a research DEA registration. But the rest of the industry, which is basically really active on LinkedIn and social media, are acting federally illegally, and we can't help them. Without the DEA registration, you are, as a laboratory, acting federally legally, but that didn't stop the cannabis industry from working for years. And last I checked, there's been no labs busted, as I have been in my nightmares almost every night. The DEA is not enforcing these issues, which is great. But for those who are on the risk-averse side, like myself and Alchemist Labs, we're sitting there watching work go away, but more just not able to help. And that's what really bugs me. So we're concerned that this is a replica of cannabis, where the lack of legal harmonization and lack of analytical harmonization has created this new wild, wild west. Those of us who have been in the industry for 20 plus years remember the wild, wild west was how strong is your ginkgo and things like that. And now it's really strange, as moved around by cannabis and the various laws county to county. It's been a big mess. And so I leave you with the end of this beginning of my presentation with 2 memes. One, I'm very proudly made these myself last night. That chamomile tea was crazy strong, said nobody ever. So again, these are plants that we work with all day and every day, are great and important, but no one is overdosed on chamomile. And we now have a situation where you might take too much and you might turn into a triceratops and stare off in the distance for a long time. So jokingly, we have a lot of work to do in this industry, and it very much so needs our help to be legitimate and thrive. And that will be the end of my presentation, Len and team. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and switch over to Rend.
All right, Rend, will tee you up. You're up next to talk from your unique perspective and experience.
All right, I am just getting ready to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second.
Thank you, Elan. That was very quickly done, and scope, what a great tee up. Okay, Rend.
All right. Hold on, sorry about that. Oh, there we go.
You're good to go.
How's that looking? All right. Well, thank you, Len, and Naturally Informed, and Heather and Maggie and everyone else for this opportunity to present on this very interesting topic. My name is Rend Al-Mondhiry. I'm a partner at Amin Talati Wasserman in our DC office. And our firm provides legal and regulatory advice to the dietary supplement, food, cosmetic, medical device, and over-the-counter medicine industries. We also provide trademark and patent support to these and a range of other industries. And I lead our hemp and CBD practice group, which is very much grounded in my years of experience with the dietary supplement industry, which is how many of you may know me. All right, so let's just get right into it. I think Elan did a great job of setting this up. And so with psychedelics, this very interesting field, we're talking about ayahuasca, and these are just a couple examples, and the active ingredient DMT, psilocybin, which is the active compound in magic mushrooms, of course, marijuana, THC, peyote, and more synthetic substances like LSD and MDMA. And these are all showing a lot of promise for resistant mental health disorders and seem to have a pretty promising safety profile. But as Elan mentioned, at the federal level, these are also Schedule I substances. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about microdosing, you might hear that term being thrown around a lot, because even these very small amounts are still illegal. Although Elan is correct, this enforcement against especially marijuana really hasn't been a priority for DEA, but it's still a risk to consider. And with respect to THC, there is an exception for hemp-derived THC and certain amounts of Delta-9 THC. And I'll talk a little bit about that and perhaps what we can learn from the cannabis model. And also, as Elan also mentioned, there is this interesting tension between federal and state laws, with the treatment of cannabis being the most high profile. And it raises a number of really interesting legal questions. And I'm going to focus more on some of the other regulatory constraints and considerations outside of these legal barriers. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not here to give any advice on the risks of selling federally controlled substances, even if those may be legal at the state level. But obviously, we can point to cannabis as a potential model for psychedelics, but also keep in mind that psychedelics pose a number of other regulatory issues, and I'll touch on some, but not all, because there are quite a few. But we are seeing a movement towards decriminalization generally, but for now, it's mostly in cities like Oakland, California, and Portland, Oregon. And actually, Oregon has legalized psilocybin for therapeutic use for residents that are 21 and over, but it's provided they work with a licensed facilitator that's trained under a government-approved program. So this is very different than what we've seen even with medicinal marijuana, and I think for a very good reason. I think we'll continue to see a movement nationally towards decriminalization and eventually legalization of drugs like psilocybin and more access to consumers, but it's unclear whether that will mean a pathway for products like dietary supplements, or even if that's the right thing to do. So what we've seen in the past few years is a huge interest in psychedelics, and it's getting more and more mainstream, as you saw from the poll that Len did. I mean, there are moms microdosing. I am not one of them. Ayahuasca retreats with shamans and ceremonies have become really popular. There's CEOs and athletes talking about the benefits. You're really seeing it everywhere. But there is a more serious side to all of this. HHS and FDA are now focused on psychedelics as potential treatments for serious mental health disorders, and clinical trials are already underway. And then this past May, in a letter to a member of Congress, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration said that it is exploring the creation of a task force focused on psychedelics, and they hinted that both MDMA and psilocybin could be approved as treatments for PTSD and depression within the next 2 years, which is a pretty aggressive timeline. But as you can see in the excerpt from this letter, the federal government is on board with psychedelics as a therapy, and they believe it can actually save lives. But again, what does this mean outside of the drug context for products like dietary supplements? And I think here there's a lot we can learn from cannabis and what's happening right now in the hemp and CBD market, especially when it comes to hemp-derived THC and similar cannabinoids, which I do think, some of which can be considered psychedelic. I think THC for sure, and some of these are not controlled substances and could be used for mental health benefits. I think in sort of the broadest sense of the term. But when the Farm Bill passed, there was a lot of excitement about the market potential of CBD, but also quite a bit of misinformation. I still see articles out there stating that CBD is legal in all 50 states, but it's so much more nuanced than that, and it ignores the reality of FDA and what the states are doing. And now we have this explosion of Delta-8 THC and other intoxicating cannabinoid products due to this loophole created by the Farm Bill's definition of hemp, which sets a limit on Delta-9 THC only. It's on a dry weight basis, which isn't really applicable to finished products. We have all these products out there with pretty high amounts of THC, even Delta-9 THC with that concentration limit. And they're easily accessible. They're even being promoted for intoxication. And actually, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals confirmed this Farm Bill loophole in a recent decision and basically said it's up to Congress to fix it, which is obviously going to take a while. But I think there's also something more to be learned here, just beyond whether something is a controlled substance. But what about FDA? What about the states? With FDA in particular, if an ingredient is synthetic, specifically if a botanical is synthetic, which is the case with some of these psychedelic ingredients, FDA stated they don't qualify as dietary ingredients. But then even if it does qualify as a botanical or the ingredient falls into another category, there's this issue of the IND preclusion, also known as the drug exclusionary clause. It's already a big obstacle for CBD and THC as well. People don't talk about that, but THC is also precluded from use in supplements and food. And because of the clinical trials underway for some of these psychedelics like psilocybin, they could be faced with the same hurdles if and when these are ever removed from scheduled status. And that means these substances may already be blocked from a supplement pathway because they've been studied as drugs and haven't been legally marketed as supplements or food. And it's questionable whether FDA would even allow these to be sold as supplements. I think potential adulteration is another significant issue. We saw this with CBD. FDA continues to raise concerns about the ability to comply with CGMPs, basically due to ongoing concerns about quality and consistency. I think in general, safety continues to be an issue too for the hemp and CBD industry, and it would very much so, I think, be the case for psychedelics. I won't rehash everything that FDA said about CBD with respect to safety, but if you're looking at THC products, for example, you have FDA and CDC raising serious health risks about Delta-8 products, states banning or imposing restrictions or other limits on all forms of THC. But despite that, these products are widely available, and it's a situation that's really hurt the reputation of the legitimate hemp and CBD industry, and I think the supplement industry as a whole. And of course, claims is another big issue, especially for CBD. And just putting disease claims aside, substantiation can pose an even bigger challenge. The science behind cannabinoids, including CBD, is still emerging. So it's not just avoiding disease claims, but firms have to be careful not to overstate the science and not rely on irrelevant studies on different products or different formulations. And for psychedelics, you can see a similar scenario. Just because psilocybin or even synthetic THC works for a population that's very mentally ill or sick people doesn't mean it's going to have the same effect on more mild conditions or healthy people. And it's not just about avoiding trouble with regulators, it's the industry's reputation that's on the line too, especially with consumers. And that's something, again, hemp and CBD industry continues to grapple with. So just to wrap up, if you want to go down the road of studying and developing psychedelics, working with experienced qualified legal counsel to guide you through the various risks is important. And even though I said I wasn't going to provide legal advice, the only advice I will provide here is that decriminalization is not the same thing as legalization. And operating within a state or a city that allows psychedelics only goes so far. Second, it's obvious the market has changed quite a bit since DSHEA, hence the recent attempts at DSHEA 2.0. But there's this fundamental principle that supplements are intended to supplement the diet, right? So if a substance is being taken purely for recreational purposes, is it or should it be a dietary supplement? And then, if psychedelics are being used to treat conditions like alcohol, opioid addiction, chronic depression, or being used as alternatives to drugs like SSRIs, what is the role of supplements in this picture? I mean, could these even, as I mentioned, could they even be helpful for occasional stress or mom burnout? Or better yet, should they be used for this? And as we continue to learn about the powerful benefits of psychedelics, safety, I mentioned that comes up, whether these products can even be used without clinical supervision. In one of the psilocybin trials from last year, there was concerns raised about participants who were experiencing suicidal impulses after treatment. So how would that be managed with supplements, for example? And then finally, I mean, given another lesson and what we've seen with CBD and especially hemp-derived THC is just the importance of the industry marketing responsibly. I already mentioned issues with claims and labeling of CBD products. It's led to some negative headlines and hurt the reputation of the product category overall. We've seen these products or a brand called Barely Legal Hemp, which sells products, a variety of THC-focused products that will probably get you high and are freely available. And there's other companies doing the same thing, but there's a crackdown on those already happening. And we're seeing functional mushrooms like lion's mane that are riding the wave of interest in psychedelics. And you have brands like Silly Girls and other brands offering what they call microdose products of things like lion's mane that have this trippy psychedelic look and are marketed as with the name shrooms. And it raises the question, is this clever branding or is it misleading and deceptive marketing that implies you'll get a psychedelic experience when that's just not the case? So I think, the big takeaway here is that, if certain psychedelics end up on a similar pathway as cannabis or hemp, the industry needs to be responsible and get the science and the safety right and be upfront with consumers and again, step back and think, is there really a role for dietary supplements in this space? Otherwise, the bad actors will easily steal the narrative and give the supplement industry as a whole a bad name. And that is all I have. So I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Rend, and Michael will get you on as our final sort of presenter here before we open up to panel and conversation.
Okay, great. It appears my video has been stopped due to the host. Maybe if you can unlock that ability. There we go. Alrighty, I will share my screen.
We're actually showing your version. If you want to restart that and just do full screen presentation.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is.
We're not seeing your screen this time.
Oh, I thought you said that you were sharing it.
No, we certainly could, but yeah, you were showing your notes version or your follow-up slide version.
Oh, I see. All right, let's see what I can do here. Apologies, everyone, for the technical difficulties. How's that?
Okay, that's still the same. There you go. You're good.
All right, success. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Barr. I'm the director of R&D at Nutrisource. Nutrisource is a clinical and regulatory consulting agency in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. We've been in business for about 20 years, and our specialty is working with supplements and botanicals to pharmaceutical standards. That experience makes us very well suited to study psychedelics. In addition, this year we received our site license to store and conduct studies using psychedelics and controlled substances. First, what are psychedelics? Psychedelics are a subclass of hallucinogenic drugs, which begs the question, what are hallucinogenic drugs? Hallucinogenic drugs are defined as drugs that trigger a non-ordinary state of consciousness. My wife would argue in that case, I am always under the influence of a hallucinogenic drug. scientists say that it is a change in thought, mood, and perception. The term psychedelic was coined in the 1950s by psychiatrist Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who is studying LSD for its ability to treat alcoholism in Saskatchewan, Canada. Psychedelic translates to mind manifesting in Greek. In a letter to the famous author Aldous Huxley, Dr. Osmond wrote, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic." Dr. Osmond then sent mescaline to Aldous Huxley, and that became the basis for his book, The Doors of Perception. The Doors of Perception is a line taken from poet William Blake that says, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." That book title inspired the band The Doors banding. How do psychedelics work? It isn't entirely clear. However, what scientists currently believe is that they increase neuroplasticity, they increase and modify the neural communication channels in the brain, and they create a hyper-receptive state of mind that makes people more receptive of psychotherapy. The physical mechanism of action is believed to be the binding of these psychedelic compounds to the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor that causes a reduction in the default mode network and an increase in the functional connectivity. One researcher put it this way: some people get locked into disorders like depression because they develop a system of thinking which is efficient but wrong. If you keep thinking, "I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I hate my life, I hate myself, I hate my job," that becomes ingrained in your mind. Those neural connections become stronger because we use them. It's like a muscle. And what I think psychedelics do is they flood the brain and they erode away those deep ingrained channels. They're like a river, those thought patterns, and you're left with a blank slate. And then from there, you're able to establish new channels of thinking. And I believe that's why therapy is so important in psychedelic treatment, because you need a trained professional to help you establish positive, good thought patterns as opposed to reverting to your old thought patterns. Why is this important? Why do we care, and why are we on this talk? I'm going to talk about market potential a little bit, and within two contexts, by market cap and by the conditions. There's no doubt that there's a lot of potential money to be made in this industry, and that has been demonstrated by the valuation of public companies and by investors' investments into this industry. Why can this make a lot of money? Because it has the potential to help a lot of sick people. It has the potential to help a lot of sick people who don't have good treatment options with current drugs, both from a financial perspective and from a physical perspective. The market cap of the top 10 companies psychedelically that are publicly traded on September 15th was $3.1 billion, with the top company, Atai Life Sciences, being valued at $669 million. In a search of clinicaltrials.gov, there are 421 studies with the term psychedelics. Conditions being investigated include depression, well aging, anxiety, PTSD, major depressive disorder, alcohol use disorder, Alzheimer's, binge eating disorder, cancer, obsessive compulsive disorder, opioid use disorder, cocaine use disorder, cluster headaches, amphetamine-related disorders, demoralization, and even Lyme disease. And those are some of the conditions I found on the first 4 pages of clinicaltrials.gov. There are many more, and it's an extremely broad area of research right now. If we just include depression, anxiety, PTSD, alcohol, and opioid use disorder, it represents a total addressable market size of $84 billion per year in the United States alone. The potential here is enormous, both to make money and to help a lot of people. Some famous psychedelic users in the scientific community include Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner in 1962, who discovered the DNA structure and used LSD. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, Nobel Prize winner, 1965, theoretical physicist specializing in quantum mechanics. He used LSD, ketamine, marijuana. And finally, Kary Mullis, Nobel Prize, 1993, founding father of polymerase chain reaction, and he used LSD. During an interview, Mullis mused aloud, "What if I had not taken LSD ever? Would I have still invented PCR?" To which he replied, "I don't know. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it." Unsurprisingly, Mullis did his PhD in Berkeley during the 1960s. That takes me to the core of the presentation today, some clinical challenges with psychedelics. This is an extremely difficult area to conduct clinical trials in for a few reasons. First, masking and blinding. Second, expectancy bias. And third, placebos. A researcher was quoted as believing that the effects of psychedelics are entirely due to the amplification of its placebo response. That makes it extremely difficult to tease out the therapeutic effect when placebo is what we're supposed to compare them to. But if all of the benefit is placebo, how do we deal with that? I've often joked with colleagues at NutriSource that we should try to take placebo down the FDA pathway to drug development because it's so effective. It's known to be so effective and appear for almost every indication. Going back to masking and blinding, what is masking and blinding? Masking and blinding is when the participant in a clinical study is unaware of whether they're in the treatment group, receiving the drug being investigated, or whether they're receiving a placebo. And the double-blind portion of clinical trials is where the researcher doesn't know whether the participant has received the active drug being investigated or whether they've received placebo. Now, this is very important because it can lead to expectancy bias. Because if you know you've received the treatment and if you have received media and if you believe that treatment will work, science has shown that you get an increased response positively to that active ingredient. So with psychedelics, there's been a lot of media purporting their benefits in psychiatric disorders. So if somebody comes into your study thinking that they're going to be beneficial, gets psilocybin, knows that they've gotten psilocybin because they have this non-ordinary state of consciousness, then they may believe that, oh, this is going to work. So the actual therapeutic effect is enhanced by their expectance. And that can also go the other way on the placebo side with the nocebo effect, where if you receive placebo, but you were hoping to get the active drug, you'll be disappointed and your conditions may worsen. And this creates a compounding effect where the people who receive the drug have an expectancy bias on the positive side, they go up, and the people on the placebo side who are disappointed go down, which creates a perceived greater gap in the therapeutic effect that's very difficult to disentangle. This graphic demonstrates all the different steps of a clinical trial. On the top in blue are the potential areas for participant bias. On the bottom in green are areas for researcher bias. You can see that at every single step, there's potential for bias, particularly at the treatment stage, where people are receiving active psychedelic drugs. So what can we do about this? What are some potential solutions? First, trial designs. There are two different options. You can give somebody an active placebo control. You can compare the psychedelic drug to a current standard of care. For active placebo, what you're trying to do is to fool people receiving the placebo into thinking that they received the psychedelic. Some examples of active placebos being investigated are niacin, which is a B vitamin that causes flushing to replicate some of the effects of psilocybin. Zinc sulfate has been used in ayahuasca trials because zinc sulfate causes nausea, which is a common side effect of ayahuasca use. Another option being used is to microdose with the drug product. In that case, in a psilocybin trial, you would give somebody a sub-hallucinogenic dose of psilocybin. In a phase 2 recently, a group used 1 microgram of psilocybin, 10 micrograms, and 25 micrograms, with 25 being the active dose. That's beneficial because in that case, you can truthfully and ethically tell everyone in the study that they will be receiving the active psychedelic, and this, they believe, will reduce expectancy bias. Another potential solution is to measure and monitor blinding and expectancy, and this is very, very important and is not commonly done. It's not, placebo and blinding and expectancy aren't huge issues for things like fish oil, where you can fill another cap with mineral oil or olive oil, and the participants won't know or feel immediately the difference. But that's not the case with psychedelics. So we need to monitor whether people knew that they got psychedelics or if they didn't. On the placebo side, did the people think that they actually took a psychedelic? And then what were their therapeutic effects? And you need to monitor people coming in if they have a positive expectation of psychedelic therapy, so that we can try to tease apart what are the therapeutic benefits that are assignable to expectancy, and what are actually the therapeutic effects derived from the active drug. Another strategy is careful recruiting and communication. Try not to communicate that it is a psychedelic study. Just talk about the indication, be very neutral in the communication about the potential benefits, and discuss how experiences to psychedelics can vary widely, and some can be quite mild. That makes it more likely that somebody to receive niacin, for example, would think that the flushing was due to them receiving a psychedelic. The use of biomarkers would be ideal, but right now there aren't a lot of great biomarkers. There's some interesting research in using brainwave EEG monitoring, which hopefully that goes well. And a final recommendation is to meet with regulators. The FDA and Health Canada are your friends here. Take advantage of them. They've created designations, breakthrough therapy, special protocol access to help. And these are extremely difficult trials to run. Work with the FDA and Health Canada. Can't recommend that strongly enough. A few quick lessons from cannabis and I'm done. Run clinical studies. In Canada, where I am, cannabis is legal recreationally. There's a lot of talk about running all these big studies. It's medicine, it's effective for anxiety, depression, et cetera, none of that materialized. When it became legal recreationally, everybody put all their efforts into that. And what happened then is people couldn't differentiate their products and it became a race to the bottom. It's now a commodity. And in a market where it's very difficult to differentiate your brand with branding and marketing, that's a real weakness. And I don't think psychedelics will go the recreational route, but it's also not impossible. In Canada, you can order psychedelics online and they'll show up on your doorstep in 24 hours. And there's dispensaries in Vancouver where you can walk in and get them. And that's exactly what happened with cannabis in the early days prior to legalization. So who knows where it'll go. So final actions for the industry: do clinical trials, run them carefully, and please don't screw this up like cannabis. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, what a great tee up, and three different perspectives, the presentation and start with Elan, the legal regulatory, and then the clinical research, clinical science environment, also compounded by the expertise within the Canadian environment, Michael. So we're going to open up for questions, so please do provide them. And I guess I'm going to start off and I think we've had perspectives on this, but let's just talk about, is there a legitimate place within the dietary supplement market? Most of the folks here are in the United States. Is there a legitimate place within the dietary supplement marketplace in the United States for the psychedelics we're talking about, or do we need to grade them? And if so, how do we grade them and how do we do it?
Rend, it sounds like a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I can kick it off. I mean, I think I went over a lot of the hurdles, but the big one right now, I mean, is this drug exclusionary clause, right? I mean, just putting aside the issue of whether it's the right thing to do, whether they're maybe microdosing, something like that, if the science can show that maybe that helps people with mild conditions and healthy people. But the drug exclusionary clause, it doesn't differentiate between the amount either. So even microdosing technically wouldn't work. It would have to take FDA to issue a regulation, which they can do under the drug exclusionary clause, to allow a substance that was studied or approved as a drug to be used in supplements or food. And I think with a lot of the outstanding safety issues, that seems unlikely. If they're not going to do it for CBD, why would they? And if we can't get them to do it for NAC, I mean, how would we get them to do it for psilocybin or something else? Especially, the fact that the drug industry has invested so much into these therapies. And, I mean, it might be one of those where, again, like we'll see where the science leads, but, I'm just sort of caught up on this legal technicality that really blocks the path to market. So I welcome anyone else's thoughts, but that to me is it's a big hurdle. It doesn't mean people aren't going to do it anyway. You saw that happen with CBD, but I was really intrigued. But what Michael said, I mean, there was this ability for people to do research in cannabis and do efficacy and do all these things, but no one's done it. And I think there's a little bit of a similar situation with hemp and CBD, it's like, people are just, rushing to market. And then, now you have this THC product boom. And I don't think there's any efficacy there. People are just, oh, here's a way to sell products that, you would normally have to get in a dispensary, and we can do that legally. So a lot of potential issues to sort out there.
My quick suspicion is no, it's not going to fit, doesn't fit. But I also wonder if it was marketed as under the therapeutic dose level, aka microdose, if it still would be triggering the drug effect that they're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, there is no specific amount that triggers it. Any just like any amount of CBD, any amount of NAC puts that product within that drug exclusionary clause, and unless there's evidence, the other exception other than FDA issuing a regulation is if there's evidence that the product was legally marketed as a supplement or a food before those clinical trials, but it was a big search for CBD. I wouldn't say that search is completely ended, but I don't know whether that evidence exists for psilocybin or some of these other psychedelics that they were lawfully sold as a food or supplement. And it could be, it doesn't have to be in the US, it could be in another country, but we just haven't looked into that at this point. I don't know that anyone has.
Elan, you mentioned sort of the origins and sort of the pillars for the APA environment, which included the indigenous. So talking about traditional use, ethnobotany. If you do scour, you probably, the shaman environment, there probably are aspects that are a little bit different from CBD. Is there a spectrum approach as is being considered there? So, and again, we'll go back to Rend, and then also the clinical research parameters that change with that. But Elan, to you first.
Yeah, fortunately, APA has some really great members of that psychedelic plant and fungi committee. And as the chair, I did some recruiting before I proposed it to the board and showed up with a bunch of heavy hitter names, some of which are actually active in exactly that, in working with indigenous people and protecting their ways of life, and also helping, perhaps to help them help the scenario where we are going to use these materials, whether they like it or not. It's happening. There's a psychedelic boom that's occurring. And so we want to make sure that there's some sustainability behind that. So there's already some really great folks in the APA committee that are active in that realm, and we'll be basically jumping on their shoulders.
But with the pharma approach, it's psilocybin as an ingredient principle. In the natural products chemistry approach, it's a spectrum of ingredients. Is there an angle there at all?
Yeah, so the pharma approach is interesting because, as we all know, most of the pharma drugs came from plants. And once we got the drugs from plants, then they worked to synthesize them without using earth and plants. So, and there's a whole other webinar about whether it's bioequivalent taking psilocybin A versus a mushroom. I personally don't like that, the pharmacibin approach. That's personal, but that's another complication. But at least the pharma approach won't be ravaging the Earth's plants and mushrooms from the ground, whereas the toad boom is having serious repercussions on the population of toads, apparently, and even peyote, is either an endangered species or closely. And the folks who are behind that traditional use are very, very concerned about the overuse and overpicking of those plants.
So responsible needs to happen. Rend, any comments on that? And Michael, your perspectives on any angle towards, natural health products? It's already happening there.
Yeah, I agree. I think I have a hard time seeing it going down the dietary supplement pathway just based on the effects. I don't eat psychedelics for lunch, so.
Okay, but this is going to impact our industry as the use propagates, the safety concerns that were expressed, the lack of quality control capabilities. It's going to impact it because it's going to tarnish. So, okay, what's the message for industry? What do we need to do? How can we protect ourselves? Can we protect ourselves? Is a relationship with pharma? So how do we ring fence this in any way, shape, or form to protect ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've already mentioned, how some of these legal barriers would be overcome. And assuming they could, I mean, perhaps there's, additional research into, other botanicals or other plants, or maybe, different parts of, mushrooms, things that, just looking at other active components of some of the raw materials there that might have promise, and determining the regulatory status of those. And, assuming that there is the potential for an ingredient that could head down the supplement pathway, I think looking into an NDI, I mean, that's really the best way to secure the legal marketing status of some of these ingredients, ones that sort of haven't already been, I hate using this word, but claimed by pharma, or ones that have already sort of gone down the drug path at this point. I mean, really, I hear this, time and time again, and it's so important to, if you have this unique compound with psychedelic properties or not, following the law and getting your product legally on the market is really key to avoiding some of these regulatory issues that the dietary supplement continues to face. And so doing all those steps can really make a difference.
Well, it's interesting, Elan, that the committee includes specifically the term fungi. So the question would be, I mean, we're seeing this traction of mushroom ingredients from a variety of standpoints. The question reads, is that the gateway, but is the mushroom category the way that this optimally lives in the DS and NHP marketplace?
I don't know. Back to Rend's point a few minutes ago, I agree 100%, but it's just, unless it's deregulated, we're all going to act federally illegally, and some of us will take risks and some of us won't. So mushrooms, there's definitely a shroom boom occurring outside of psychedelia, with lion's mane and chaga and cordyceps, and these have been around forever, but suddenly people are excited about them. You get some celebrities posting about them and taking them, and I now take all 4 of those in the morning and love them. But I think because of the shroom boom happening in the natural products industry, perhaps psilocybin is getting kind of pulled with that, and might be the more popular one, perhaps. I personally think there's probably more benefits in microdosing ayahuasca or even LSD than mushrooms, but that's a set of personal experience, knowing that one makes me tired, one makes me not tired. So, but I don't know. I think the mushrooms might be the gateway, just because popularity and simplicity, and they're super easy to grow. They grow from shit. Ayahuasca is not so much, and LSD has to be made. So as an example, these are very, very sustainable harvesting. You can grow them up, you can grow them down, you can grow them indoors, outdoors. There's all sorts of options, and it grows by itself on basically nothing. So perhaps that's one of the reasons the psilocybin might be pushing the front of that one.
And Michael, what do you say on the clinical research environment around sort of mushroom-based ingredients?
I think there's a lot, and it's very, very, people are looking at all sorts of different indications, all sorts of just different clinical designs in terms of what placebos they're trying to use. There isn't a consensus. There isn't a lot of experience. I was talking to NutriSource's CEO this morning, and he talked about this is so early. It's in its infancy. For so many, like statins, there's a well-established pathway, and there are well-established clinical strategies to use. That doesn't exist. But with mushrooms, we see confusion, to be honest, and regulators are confused, but everything's going at such a fast pace, and there's so much need that we're going ahead with studies, and people are doing the best they can to clinically prove that these things work and that they are helping people. And we're trying to figure out what treatments do they need. One thing that we're seeing on the clinical side is that therapy is a key piece of these drugs being used as a treatment. It's not just you give someone mushrooms and you send them on their jolly way. It's you do 3 sessions without active drugs to establish a relationship with the therapist. Then they have a session on a psychedelic drug. Then they have 2 more sessions to decompress that session, then another one, same pattern. And that seems to be extremely important. But that has a big implications on what is this therapy going to cost? Because you're looking at hours and hours and hours of therapy. I think MAPS recently suggested that the treatment would cost $7,500 for their use, and 90% of that is in therapist time. It's like $750 for drug products. So it's that those are some of the things we're seeing on the mushroom side.
One question that's come in, and I think it's related to what you talked about with the commoditization, Michael, principally, if these chemicals, products, ingredients become commoditized, what are the differentiation strategies that the companies that are legitimately trying to operate in the space that they can use to leverage against each other with guidance? And Ren, you probably have a perspective on that too, I would imagine. Michael, start with you.
Sure. Claim substantiation. So prove that your drug does something for some indication, and then that's validated. You go to market with that claim. You can tell doctors. That's one interesting thing, is if you're going to doctors and therapists, they're going to need to know that this works, and what does it work for, and where is the clinical proof that it works for that indication. That's the way to differentiate yourself, whether that's depression, addiction, it doesn't matter. The formula is the same. And it's interesting because psychedelics are really making us question a lot of things that are foundational pillars in clinical research, but it's still a requirement. It's the best we've got. So we need to do clinical studies, even if placebo effects are hard to tease apart, even if masking is hard to tease apart, because we don't have another option. The other option is to just give people LSD and ayahuasca. And there are potential adverse events, and I'll say dangers to be colloquial, because they're so powerful and profound. I talked to a psychiatrist in LA who's the CSO of a psychedelic company, and he talks about in his practice, a lot of these, I'll call them LA moms, are going down to South America. They do an ayahuasca trip, they come back, and he's saying that he's putting the pieces back together. And he's seeing this over and over again. And he kind of quipped to me, like, why don't you just start with 1.5 grams of mushrooms? But people, we hear all this news and media. It's cool. We want to tell our friends that we did it. So we go into the Brazilian jungle and trip on ayahuasca. And these are potent, powerful substances. But just like all drugs have adverse events. This is not unique. And I'm not trying to demonize psychedelics by saying they have adverse events and that they need to be treated with respect. That's all drugs. So I guess that's my stance there.
Okay, we'll move.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Michael said. I mean, I think what we have now is sort of like a grayish black market for these, and it's become very popularized. You see TV shows where people are doing these ayahuasca rituals, but you don't see the other side of it. And who, like, if you're finding a shaman to do it, what's their credentials? Like, how do you research that? I mean, it's an industry now that doesn't really have that much structure. And I mean, you're putting a lot of trust into whether it's, a therapist or whomever to know how they're going to manage, like Michael said, that back end of it, putting the pieces together. And I think doing it the right way, following the appropriate pathway for marketing that product is what gives it more legitimacy. It's what gets, healthcare professionals on board with this, knowing that adverse events, how to address those, and kind of moving it out of this popularized pop culture type movement. And because we've seen, the federal government is taking this seriously. And so we have this tension now between, it's like, what's become sort of recreational and popular, but also has, I think, some dangerous side effects that need to be managed. And then, the government is looking at it sort of in that lens of legitimate therapy. So, I mean, I think that those are going to have to be reconciled. And we saw what's happened with cannabis, and the lines are sort of blurred. And you know, but still, I would say that cannabis as you know, drug treatment, as a drug and for treatment is, I mean, that's still ongoing more in the pharma realm, of course, but I think, you know, doing it right is going to be really important for the industry.
I just like to add, agreeing with both of you on that, but I think one thing to remember is that these plants and fungus have thousands of years of time-tested experience, which is a lot more than all the FDA-approved drugs new to us have ever had and ever will, and no one's ever died from these things. I think, Michael, what you said about the therapist putting pieces back together, yeah, integration is really critical, and making sure this remains professional and mature, responsible industry is the only way it'll stay, because if you don't, and people start going to the jungle or taking these things at Disneyland or whatever as recreational, you can have some terrible experiences, but no one's going to die. That's one thing, that no one has ever died from these products. Maybe someone who stepped out of a window, you know, which probably happens more often with alcohol than anything else. So back to responsibly regulated, I think, again, we have to take a look at the genie is out of the bottle and it's not going back anytime soon or ever. And I think we need to get ahead of it and, you know, perhaps carefully decriminalize, deregulate it so it can be used professionally, because if we don't, it's going to have these outside circles of, you know, everyone's suddenly a shaman, you know. and
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much I'm being advertised to go to special retreats for $20,000 in Jamaica. Like every day I get an advertisement for it at this point. It sounds great, but I don't know who these people are, you know, and what they're, like Rend said, their qualifications, what makes you able to guide through this experience. And like you said, Michael, put the pieces back together in the end, because that is a critical point, critical piece of these experiences.
Yeah, so the integration, proper regulation, health professional integration are the takeaways. Disclaimer again, this is a technical, scientific, legal conversation. And for the natural health products dietary supplement specifically, not intended to prevent, cure, or treat disease. I think it was appropriate to sort of close with that. Thank you to the panel.